Hi, I'm Gary Younge.
And I'm Carys.
Every week, Carys and I will be talking about those stories in the news that are overreported and the ones that are going completely under the radar and not talked about enough.
This is Over the Top, Under the Radar. This episode is sponsored by Letterbox Library.
So, Carys, how you doing?
One of the many things we have in common is a lot of our family members have very concentrated birthdays. So this is the week that both my mum and brother have their birthdays. And I smashed my mum's birthday present. Well, she listens to the podcast, right? And if you disagree, we went to see Joan Armour Trading, not perform, unfortunately, talk. We had a nice dinner. We went to see her speak, and it was just like a lovely mother-daughter date. And Joan Armour Trading is such a badass.
What was she talking about?
I think she's got a book of her lyrics out, but one of the many likable things about her is she doesn't have a huge ego and she's not really self-promoting. There were books on sale of her lyrics, but she didn't really plug them.
Right.
And if she was in conversation with someone, she would just be sort of telling these anecdotes, but in a very like, oh yeah, and then Bob Dylan invited me to like be at his festival. Yes, that's what I've been up to. What about you on your travels, Easter hauls?
Well, I went to see Ta-Nehisi Coates speak about Palestine.
Oh, he was in London, was he?
Yeah, he was in London very briefly. It was organised by the Palestine Literary Festival, which I've been on. They take writers to Palestine. And they had taken Ta-Nehisi, and it was a transformative experience for him. And it's interesting because he'd written a book on reparations in which it said, Israel got it right. People responded, and he responded to their response. And then he went to Palestine with the Literary Festival. So he wrote a book called The Message, which is a kind of, the next step on his journey.
Yeah, so I know about The Message. I didn't know about the previous comments on Israel. He writes very powerfully about Palestine, but he also writes about the sort of sense of betrayal that he'd been lied to as an American about Israel, like what Israel was, which makes sense if he had previously said different things. It is about going to Palestine, and it is also about the political and media consensus in America about what Israel is, and him going as an African-American man being like, this isn't a democracy, this is Jim Crow. And he got a lot of flack for that in the media. But no, so is he talking about that or just generally vibing?
He was interviewed by a woman called Zaina Aga, who's of Palestinian heritage or Palestinian. And it was good because it was interesting. She was challenging him. He was really into being challenged. And I don't know that there's another way to do it. And one of her things was like, she said, the bit I really didn't like was when you go to, once again, I have to access Palestinian pain through Jewish pain. All your stuff about going to Yad Vashem and so on. It's not that there's no place for that, but I'm Palestinian and we have our own pain and we always have to go through the Holocaust in order to get to my pain. He effectively said, yeah, I guess it wasn't written for you, like it comes from a different place and it comes from the place that I was at and I can only be true to myself. And I do quite a lot of book events. It's quite rare that, someone's like, yeah, didn't like this. But it was all very respectful and he wasn't particularly defensive and it was healthy and it was good. I love the Palestine Literary Festival, so it was good.
There's a really good podcast. Maybe we can link to it in the newsletter that comes from a very different perspective of Ta-Nehisi Coates in conversation with Ezra Klein, who's an American journalist with Jewish heritage and also on the left, where he is also critiquing the book, but from a slightly different perspective. What comes across in that is someone who's very open to be told you're wrong or you got this wrong or you disagreed. And I think it sounds like the event was like that as well. That sort of turning the temperature down on a conversation, being like, someone can say you're wrong or I didn't like this, and you do not have to sort of punch back. Russell sent over an email saying, I was pleasantly surprised to hear your discussion of Labour's spat to Sentencing Council this week. I'm a Patreon subscriber and criminal defence barrister. We love it. I'm still furious about it now, and you will know the council has suspended the guidelines in the meantime after the government threatened to legislate. I thought you might be interested. A report some colleagues of mine contributed to called Racial Bias and the Bench. I think, in fact, Gary chaired an event about it a year after its launch to discuss what progress had been made. Most importantly, I really enjoy the podcast and try to spread word of it wherever I can in solidarity, Russell. Thanks for writing in, Russell. Gary, do you remember that event?
I do remember that event. It was at the British Academy, and I'm a bit embarrassed, actually, that while we were talking about it, that I didn't mention Racial Bias in the Bench. It's a very good document. It's very easy to read. It's one of those things that highlights all the ways in which they've got this wrong in this moment for all the wrong reasons. So thank you, Russell. You can find us all over socials, be it Blue Sky, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, or X at @over_under_pod_.
Big shout out to everyone who joined us on Patreon recently. Gigi, Lee, Pete, and David have all signed up as Patreon supporters. We have 478 Patreon supporters, of which 440 are fully fledged paying Patreon members. Thank you so much.
The team and I make this podcast because we believe there's an audience out there of people just like us, people like you, who are being fouled by so-called mainstream media. And that audience consists of people who are comfortable with an unashamedly progressive perspective on politics and life, but also have a sense of humour and a sense of irony.
Gary and I, and the small black production company behind the podcast, are not all paid for what we do. Because our values matter to us, we don't take random adverts. We only accept sponsorship and support from organisations whose values align with ours. So it's your individual contributions that really keep this space alive.
So if you enjoy the pod and find value in what we do, please consider donating. The packages start at just £5 plus VAT a month. And if you already donate, please consider upgrading your membership. Please.
If you support us on Patreon, you will get the podcast episode, a bonus episode, the weekly newsletter, and access to our exclusive and very fun over-under WhatsApp community.
Search Over the Top, Under the Radar on Patreon. And please, put your money where your ears are. Today, Carys, I want to talk about free trade and the Windrush scandal. What about you?
Today, I'm going to talk about regulating hedge funds. It's more interesting than you think, and the royal family.
Let's get to it. This has been a week. Every time I click on anything newsy, it feels like it's going to get crazier. Last time I looked, we're recording on Wednesday this week, Tom was talking about 104% tariffs on China. A recession is being priced in almost everywhere. The markets are going nuts and plunging. And within all this, and the reason why this is my over the top isn't obviously because we shouldn't be talking about tariffs, but the way that we are talking about it is as though what preceded it in terms of the globalization that we had, the international trade that we had, the system that we had, that it's replacing something good with something bad. And what it's doing, in fact, is replacing something bad with something that was even worse. The trade that we had prior to this kind of moment of panic and craziness, thanks to Trump, wasn't free and it wasn't fair. The wealthier countries made the rules and imposed them on the poorer countries, many of whom were struggling with the legacies of colonialism. I remember interviewing Jesse Jackson, 1999, and him saying, you know why black people do better at sports when they don't do so well in other areas is because when you're playing a sport, the rules are known and the playing field's even. When we are doing other things, and for me, this includes international trade, he said, when the field is tilted and the rules are weighted against one side, then it's really difficult to do well. For example, the EU in 1975, it was EEC then, signed something called the Lomé Convention. And what that was about was supporting the previous colonies as they emerged into the global order. So the EU bought sugar and bananas, for example, an inflated price from what were called ACP countries, African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries. They got rid of that. And so you have countries now like Barbados that used to produce sugar, doesn't produce sugar anymore. It was the equivalent of closing down a pit in a pit town and then leaving them with almost nothing, not giving them time to restructure or any of that. And so the powerful made the rules to suit themselves. So American cotton was protected, European steel was subsidized, but you had these poorer countries that were not able to protect their industries. And that was as a result of multinationals basically writing the rules. So bananas, for example, that were coming out of Central America, but that were basically produced by American-based multinational companies, they crushed the banana industries in much of the Caribbean in order to produce these bananas that were effectively tasteless and full of pesticides because it suited them. So there was that. It wasn't free. It wasn't fair. Secondly, the way that the international global system worked, it worked against any democratic institution that sought some different kind of system that wouldn't give preferential treatment to either multinationals or the rich or so on. So when Lula was elected in Brazil the first time, what happened was because he had an agenda of redistribution, the currency plummeted by 30%. $6 billion in hot money left the country in between when he was elected and when he was sworn in. He hadn't even done anything yet. It just said he might. Agencies start to give Brazil some of the highest debt risk ratings in the world. And one only has to imagine, say, if Corbyn had been elected in 2017, and actually it was closer than you'd think, the degree to which the international trading system, the international monetary system would have moved against Britain to punish Britain for making the wrong choice. They've done that all around the world. And finally, the international trading system was built into it that because of local politics and international trade, capital can move, but people couldn't. That in the same time that you could press a button and shift billions of dollars anywhere in the world that you want, shut down a factory in Sunderland and open it again in India, anybody who wanted to go from India to Sunderland suddenly had real problems. And if you look at, say, some of the places that are most affected by these tariffs or some of the companies, there'll be places where they've moved the company or they've moved the production to a place where labor is cheaper and unions are weaker and they can pay people less. And it's why the tariffs are so high on countries like Vietnam and Cambodia. And that wasn't good either. First of all, the tariffs are terrible. We know that. But actually, this is one of those situations, and Trump throws them up quite a lot, where it's like, yes, what he's doing is bad, but let's not return to what we were doing before because that was also bad. And we can and should be doing better in terms of having a free trade system that, first of all, recognizes our legacies of colonialism, and secondly, doesn't have an international legal system where powerful countries get to dictate to poorer countries what they can and can't protect in their home and, you know, how the world should be. So that's my over.
It's the biggest story of the week, or the tariffs are the biggest story of the week. Yeah, I think something I really want to agree on, because it's something I have experience of because I'm half Ghanaian, is that the US, those who are in favor of free trade, which I agree is a loaded term and we don't actually have, do leave out the subsidies that wealthy countries use to make their goods cheaper. So in Ghana, even though we grow our own rice, American and Japanese and like rice from other countries was so heavily subsidized that we ended up being a net importer. So Trump is wading into a very unjust system with a blunt instrument that is unlikely to make things fairer for the poorest people in America or anywhere in the world. But yeah, I think this idea of free trade is definitely a fallacy. I think the thing I find interesting about the panic and pandemonium of this week is that really what we're seeing is this president who very clearly signaled that he is for big business and rich people by having a ton of billionaires sat behind him when he was sworn in, actually isn't serving, at least in the short or medium term, the billionaire class or all of these companies that like have cravenly bent his will, because capitalism likes certainty, right? It likes to know what's going to happen so it can move its money around. And I think in addition to there being no real conversation about the reality of our trade system and the fact that we do not have free trade, we have trade on terms that benefit wealthy nations, is also the fact that, and the Lula example is one, Liz Truss is also another, that we have a very conservative financial system that doesn't like shocks or uncertainty or any changes to the status quo. And it would undoubtedly be different if it was someone on the left trying to bring in protectionist policies or impose rules on how goods and services move internationally. And it's hard to detach from anything that Trump does because it's so stressful and scary. And ultimately, it will make a lot of people poorer and not just people who own stocks and shares. But I think it is interesting to see how much globalized capitalism doesn't want anything to change. And I think in that sense, it is instructive for the left, because if a left-wing leader came in the UK, the US, we have examples of people like Lula in Brazil, you would have this and you would have a full media machine attacking that left-wing person and basically calling for a coup. Whereas Trump gets some weird grace, even though he's like Liz Truss on steroids. I don't think Trump is smarter than Liz Truss, but I think he is surrounded by some very scary people like Stephen Miller, who probably have some awful right-wing, we're remaking the global economy plan. So yeah, there's a lot of noise about it this week, but it doesn't seem to be about the right things.
Well, he's also more powerful than Liz Truss. So when Liz Truss went on her bender, lettuce racing bender, she basically broke our economy. She didn't really break anybody else's economy. Whereas America is sufficiently powerful that when it decides that it's going to do something like this, then it becomes everybody else's problem.
I mean, I think the other thing to say as well is that tariffs are regressive. Like, they're not going to benefit poorer people because most likely they will just make goods and services more expensive. But economic sanctions are not, there was a raft of economic sanctions imposed on Russia because of the conflict in Ukraine. So I think there's also this sense of, as ever with Trump, people like to use hyperbole and pretend this is like so unprecedented and crazy. And what's he up to now? He's operating outside of the sort of centrist neoliberal consensus, but he's not using tools and levers that other politicians and other powerful economic nations don't use. He's just not using them in a way that mainstream media likes or considers acceptable. It feels like a lot of noise and very little interesting insight. My under the radar is the announcement from the Treasury on Monday that alternative asset managers will no longer be subject to the main rules and regulations of the sector if they manage under £5 billion. So stay with me, don't fall asleep. Alternative asset managers are hedge funds and private equity companies. That's how they're known in the biz. And right now, they're regulated by the Treasury, by the Financial Conduct Authority. And the regulations kick in at the moment at £100 million. So if you're a private equity company or a hedge fund and you're moving about £100 million, there's a set of rules and regulations that you've got to follow. The Treasury is now consulting on moving that amount up to £5 billion. So that's right. Used to be cool 100 mil. There's certain disclosures, there's certain things you've got to tell people. Now the Treasury, I mean, it's consulting. Consultation is open, I believe, until June. So feel free to respond. But consultation often means they've decided to do it. So they're consulting, but they've decided that private equity companies and hedge funds really shouldn't have to worry about regulation till they hit £5 billion. One of the reasons I think this has gone under the radar is it's a little bit techie and it's about financial services. I don't think this has had enough coverage given everything else going on. In the current context, the government, the Treasury, think that a set of companies who are pretty notorious for being reckless, economically irresponsible, need less regulation and less scrutiny. The other thing that is like quite wild about this story that hasn't been covered is the sort of rubric and rationale for saying, just leave these guys alone unless they're managing 5 billion. It's just too onerous for these companies, moving around 100 million, 200 million to have to comply with all these regulations. So the rationale behind this move is if we deregulate or reduce regulation, we will attract more hedge funds, more private equity firms to the UK. They will do more business. We will make more money. I'm going to call bullshit. Hedge funds in the UK already manage £355 billion of assets. That is 85% of the total in Europe. This is according to the Alternative International Management Association. So according to hedge funds and private equity companies, the UK has 85% of the assets they're managing. We account for more than half of the 1.15 trillion euros of private equity capital under management in Europe. So basically, we've already got most of these hedge funds and private equity companies in the UK, presumably because we don't regulate them enough. The proposal that we will give them even less regulation to attract even more just feels wild to me. Also, Gary, whilst this may not lose us money because the consultation is not about these companies paying less tax, and I do want to be clear about that, we are potentially creating some real headaches for the UK in the long term. Why? Number one, private equity companies love the healthcare sector and they bloody love the NHS. So at a time when they could be pouring in and asset stripping and doing all of the unethical things that they are known to do, we're saying that unless they are running a book of £5 billion or more, we're going to pay less attention to their activities. And then the final thing I think to say is there is a systemic risk that could grow if we pay even less attention to private equity firms and hedge funds. What regulators are mainly losing is visibility by a set of companies that are known for taking a lot of risks. I don't want to be too Cassandra-ish, but hedge funds and private equity firms did not cause the financial crash, but they were out there making money from it and helping to destabilize an already crappy system. So yeah, this has gone really under the radar. It's absolutely terrifying. I'm also, I assume, not alone in feeling like the UK does not need more private equity companies and hedge funds.
Just by coincidence, the benefit crackdown on disabled people, you know how much it saves?
How much?
5 billion quid. Because there is a sense of like, it's not so much. And it's like, well, actually, I think we pretty much made it clear that that is a lot of money. Now, I know that this isn't a tax issue. I know that. But we saw from 2008 the way in which deregulation and the things that come with deregulation can become tax issues. So they deregulate the system. The system crashes because people find ways to do things that are unsustainable and make a quick buck. And then the losses, while the profits are individualized, individuals take the profits or these companies take the profits, the losses are collectivized. We ended up as taxpayers paying for the 2008 crash in reduced services and so on. So when these deregulation binges happen, there will be a price to pay at some point because the regulations are there for a reason. And so when it all spins out of control, which it inevitably will, we will have to pay. And there's a sense in which we've been paying for the last 15 years, 17 years from the previous bout of deregulation. And as you point out, Britain is already a leader in this world. We are already the place where most of this money goes. So you could say, well, they want to keep their competitive advantage, but who's going to pay for that?
The real plot twist in this, so we're the leader in Europe, we've got a ton of these companies, and this isn't a new thing. It has been the case ever since Brexit. There is a risk that by changing the rules from what the norms are in Europe, where there are similar thresholds, that you actually risk Brussels bringing a penalty in. So if we don't have harmonized rules with the rest of Europe, then this could trigger a regulatory backlash from Brussels. So even if you thought that it was a good thing that we have all of these private equity companies and hedge funds, it's actually not clear deregulating would be helpful. And just so we're clear, this now means that there's going to be less transparency and information around remuneration, so how people are getting paid. Depository requirements won't be required, valuation of assets, frameworks around risk management. Let us remember, these are the companies that were behind things like the collapse of the Body Shop, the absolute shit show that was Debenhams. As things stand, these companies are not being sufficiently regulated. I would argue they are not economically valuable actors. And I think, the through line to the Trump trade tariffs stories is that in the 1980s, Thatcher and Reagan and the people surrounding them decided that manufacturing wasn't valuable. They enacted what is known as the Big Bang and massively deregulated financial services. We still live with the consequences of that. The idea that the best thing to do at the moment is to give a bunch of companies that are already not under enough scrutiny. We've seen that with Southern Cross. We've seen that with Debenhams. We've seen that with the Body Shop. These are asset strippers. These are people who speculate on currencies, on markets, who, when the financial crash was happening, hedge funds are the ones cleaning up. The idea that we're going to massively reduce the amount of oversight and regulation for a ton of firms is just pretty scary. And just so that you've got a sense of what it means, the alternative asset managers subject to the full rules will go from 699 companies to 64. So 64 companies will now need to comply with these rules. Hundreds of others will not. I wonder how many companies there are that are at the sort of 5.5 billion mark that might suddenly find that actually they're at 4.9 billion. So yeah, this feels like bad regulation. This is a set of actors that we really should be paying closer attention to. And apparently we're now going to be paying less attention. So I'm grumpy enough that I might reply to the consultation, Gary. I doubt it will be read by anyone, but I'll put a link in the newsletter in case anyone else wants to. This episode is brought to you in partnership with Letterbox Library, a children's bookseller and co-runner of the Little Rebel Award for Radical Children's Fiction, celebrating equality and diversity since 1983.
They started out when two mums in Hackney couldn't find books where girls had leading roles, so they built a collection full of them themselves. Today, Letterbox Library is a workers' co-op dedicated to making sure every child can see themselves in a story across race, gender, disability, mental health, LGBTQ plus identities, and family structure.
You can get 20% off any order at letterboxlibrary.com with the code OVERUNDER20. And if you're working in policy or education, check out their curated book packs for schools and early years. These include UK Black history, gender stereotype busting stories, and characters of colour in leading roles selected by real-life educators. My mum would have loved this when we were growing up.
As the godfather of 6 children and then 2 children of my own, you want to think ahead to Christmas and birthdays and just, get it locked in. In a media world shaped by red pill content, where the weight of identity, loneliness, and masculinity play out on screen, kids and teens need access to inclusive, empowering stories. Stories that help them imagine a world where they belong and where others do too.
So visit letterboxlibrary.com and help build a future where every child's story gets told.
My under radar is the £22,000 that the government has spent suppressing a report into the roots of the Windrush scandal. For those of you who don't live in Britain and don't know, the Windrush scandal was the product of a hostile environment kind of policy that the Tories had back in 2010, 2020, which effectively left a significant group of mainly elderly Caribbean people who were British citizens, but that couldn't provide all of the proof that was necessary to explain that they had been in Britain for the last 60 years. These are people who had children, had grandchildren, who were working, who'd paid taxes. The government had the information, but they said, you have to prove it to us. You have to provide 3 pieces of information for every year you've been here since you were a toddler. And if you can't, you're out. This meant that a large number of British citizens were deprived of their British citizenship, were pauperized, they were kicked out of council housing, they were denied healthcare. Some of them were actually deported. So it was a scandal in the truest sense of the word. It was a story that The Guardian broke. And what would happen was when The Guardian were just about ready to publish a story about an individual and how they'd been treated, an old person from St. Lucia or St. Kitts or Barbados or Jamaica, who could no longer get their cancer care or who was being kicked out of their house, then the government would say, oh, yeah, we found, yeah, they're good. So they knew. They produced a report. And the report said, among other things, it concluded that the origins of the, and now I'm quoting, deep-rooted racism of the Windrush scandal, they said it, lies in the fact that, quote, during the period 1950 to 1981, every single piece of immigration or citizenship legislation was designed, at least in part, to reduce the number of people with black or brown skin who were permitted to live and work in the UK. They didn't want people to know that. Wendy Williams, the independent inspector who advised the department on what changes to make in the wake of the scandal, and this wasn't in the report, this was elsewhere, found, quote, officials' poor understanding of Britain's colonial history had been one of the causes. So they get this report saying, look, British immigration system, it's always been racist. And bearing in mind, this is from 1950 to 1981. 1948, anyone who lived in a colony was effectively a British citizen and could come and work. 48 was the year that Windrush docked. Windrush was a boat, the HMT Windrush, which brought about 500 Jamaican ex-servicemen to Britain and was the symbolic arrival of post-colonial migration. So here's the thing about this. First of all, it illustrates that this scandal, the Windrush scandal, was not a glitch in the system. It was the system. It was the system operating pretty much as it was intended and had been for more than half a century before. Secondly, the scandal was heinous. And then to suppress the report into the scandal, also heinous. Where are these people who advocate for free speech? Once again, where are they? You want free speech? Here's a report, a government report that's being suppressed. What you got to say about that? And that it speaks to the British inability to metabolize its colonial past. The Home Office has paid around 108 million in compensation to just over 3,000 individuals, which is nowhere near all of the people who were affected. It averages about £35,000 a person. They paid 22 grand to suppress the report. At least 53 claimants have died before receiving the compensation. They're spending money not telling people what happened and why it happened when they should be spending the money more quickly, more effectively on the people that it happened to. And finally, and this works not just for Windrush, for a whole lot of other stuff, that people call this post-colonial amnesia or colonial amnesia, like Britain just forgot. But you don't forget that you owned pretty much half the world, that you extracted minerals and people and trade from large parts of the world by force. You don't forget that like you forget an umbrella or you forget somebody's name. Actually, you have to work really hard at it. And when they suppress a report like this, what they're doing is an active process of forgetting where Britain's been, what it's done, and how it did it. Even as that history keeps coming up again and again in the present, not particularly distant history either. We remember 1066, we remember the Tudors and so on, but somehow this stuff that happened 50, 60 years ago and that had implications just 5, 6 years ago and is still having implications now, somehow we have this capacity to forget in real time. And it's not something that just happens to us. It's something that we make happen time and time again. That's my under.
The guys from Peep Show have a sketch show, and one of the sketches is them as Nazis being like, are we the baddies? And I feel like when you're dropping 22 grand to stop the truth coming out about internal racism and a bunch of people who've experienced systematic injustice. And when you're signing off the invoice to some law firm who failed to suppress the information, I wonder if a little part of you thinks, am I the baddie here? Paying a huge corporate law firm to make sure no one knows how racist we are? Yeah, I think Windrush, obviously there was a moment where people were paying attention to it, but I think it does continue to go under the radar unless you are impacted by it and you are, one of the families that has had to live with the consequences of it. So yeah, it's always worth talking about and bringing to people's attention. Yeah, and that the government just can't fess up to what we all know. And it didn't even work because we all saw the report anyway. So that was
good work.
Money well spent. If you're trying to cut costs, Rachel, maybe find those people because they're not the A-team. So my over the top for the week is Prince Harry. There's a couple of Prince Harry stories doing the rounds in the news at the moment. He's in court for his case challenging his security detail. So he thinks he needs to have more state-funded security. It's a closed-door hearing, but that has not stopped there being a ton of coverage of it. We had to hear that Harry was writing post-its that he passed to his legal team. He was seen eating a pret-a-manger lunch. These are the levels of detail we're getting about the case. Hot on the heels of a charitable scandal that he's also been involved in for one of the organizations he's a patron of, which is a special thing. It's not the same as being a trustee or working for a charity. Charity's called Centre Barley. He's in some sort of a beef with one of the trustees. So that's been playing out. I won't even get into Meghan's jam, which he started selling and the Daily Mail have reviewed as not good. So there's just always a lot of coverage of Prince Harry. I would argue too much. I'm for him going up against the media when he's been mistreated. I'm neutral on the security stuff. I don't want to buy Meghan's jam. But just generally, I feel like a big chunk of the media is always looking for an excuse to write a story about Prince Harry or to write a story about Harry and Meghan being terrible or awful or money grubbing. Prince Harry is obviously clickbaity. There's a ton of people who want to hate click on Prince Harry and Meghan and read those stories. I'm not knocking the hustle. I am saying we are now at a point where these stories are non-stories. Nothing is happening. We're talking about the fact he's writing post-it notes in court, not newsworthy. He's in court every other day. None of us can keep up. Him and Meghan are always beefing with someone. My issue, Gary, is we are going way over the top on Prince Harry and we're getting nothing on Prince Andrew. So hear me out. Number one, Prince Andrew is allegedly a nonce. There is some pretty compelling evidence, some of which came from him himself in a wild interview with Emily Maitlis that has since been dramatized, that he was very good pals with Jeffrey Epstein and did some incredibly illegal and horrible things to at least one young woman. And then, let us not forget, it turned out my man was friends with an alleged Chinese spy. So what I'm saying, Gary, is look, it's so rich. Also, if you're going to scrutinize a member of the royal family's charity, Centre Barley, which is the Harry charity, and I mean, I listened to a whole podcast about something at a polo match and who felt snubbed. Prince Andrew used to run something called Pitch at the Palace, which was like his version of Dragon's Den, where people came and pitch at, I assume, Buckingham Palace or one of the palaces to get money. His Chinese pal, who we believe may have been a spy, there was a Chinese version of Pitch at the Palace. Why is no one investigating that, Gary? So I'm not going to come here. I'm sure many of our listeners are not big into the royal family or stories about the royal family, but my pitch to you and the news editors of the UK is less Harry, more Andrew. It's a richer vein. There's going to be loads of tea and the Harry stuff. Like 4% of the UK like Prince Andrew, Gary. I looked into it. 4%. So you'll still get the hate clicks.
What percentage like Harry?
Harry's low. He's disliked by 44% and he's liked by 30%. He's significantly more popular, but also, I'm going to argue, he's significantly less interesting. Well, I've argued it. That's my belief. We're going over on Harry, we're going under on Andrew. I want the dirt.
Well, I guess I start from the premise that I do want to know if they have broken a law or if they've, in the rare, unlikely moment that they have done something exceptionally good. I don't want to dirt on these people. I don't think these people should really exist, not as people, but as structurally, their jobs, well, they don't have jobs.
Well, they cut ribbons, Gary, and they do get paid for it.
Yeah,
pay them.
I kind of, I want less about them unless we're talking about getting rid of them. But you and me are different about this, because I remember during the Harry, Meghan, I remember talking to you way before the podcast about their wedding. And I was like, I'm not fucking interested. And you were like, you really were.
Yeah, that was 7 years ago, Gary. I can't stand. That was when I was Team Harry and Meghan. I can't stand by them anymore. We've all had to leave that go. I thought it was an interesting window into race relations. And as someone with mixed heritage, I think there was a point when she entered the royal family that we were seeing a lot of things play out in a very weird, fusty institution that many of us have seen that play out in our own lives. And I think the level of racism she experienced and the fact that Prince Harry had to have a non-white partner to understand racism properly, I thought that was all interesting. But I think we've long passed the point where I can defend Harry and Meghan, unfortunately.
I guess even then, I just thought, well, mixed race relationships are a banal fact of life in Britain. What's amazing about this is actually that it's taking you so long to have one in a family. I just kind of, they're not interesting people on their own merits. They're not interesting. The institution is done. It was done like from 1789, as far as I'm concerned, and French Revolution. And I don't want to know about these people beyond if they're committing a crime or the extent to which they are public figures. And they are public figures because we pay them to be public figures. And I think I've told the pod before that I have actually met Prince Andrew.
You've definitely not told me that. What?
Oh, right. Yeah, I met him there was an event at Windsor for journalists thrown by the royal family. The Queen was there, smaller than you'd expect. Height-wise, yeah.
Yeah.
And I went because I was curious. I didn't write about it, but I went because I was curious. And whenever I saw one of them, like Princess Anne, I came quite close to Princess Anne, I would just kind of walk the other way because I didn't really want to speak to them. But while I was walking away from someone else, I turned around and bumped into him. And he insisted on speaking to me. And he said, "What are you writing about?" And I said, "Racism, mostly." And he said, "Well, there's not a lot of that around anymore, is there?" At which point, some bullshit and people who want to have an argument with Prince Andrew, I won't mention their names, but who are columnists, kind of waded in, and I just walked off. I'm like, I don't want to talk to you about racism.
You just home symptoms into the head. You were like,
yeah, it was, yeah. But yeah, there you go.
One for the memoirs, Gary.
One for the memoirs.
Thank you for listening to Over the Top, Under the Radar.
Remember to like, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to support the show, find us by searching Over the Top, Under the Radar on Patreon.
You can sign up to our newsletter at overunderpod.com, and you can connect with us on social media at over_under_pod_. See you next week when Gary will be away and I will be joined by the brilliant journalist Nadine White. This episode has been sponsored by Letterbox Library.